Captain Rebecca Torres adjusted her uniform one final time before entering the Stark conference room at Edwards Air Force Base. 5 years of careful planning had led to this moment. 5 years of living under a borrowed identity, suppressing her true abilities and waiting for the perfect opportunity to reclaim what had been stolen from her. The X-47 experimental aircraft program was her ticket back to the sky. 3 senior officers sat behind an imposing mahogany table, their faces illuminated by harsh fluorescent lighting. Her fabricated service record lay open before them, alongside psychological assessments and flight simulation scores that she deliberately kept impressive but not extraordinary. She couldn't afford to stand out, not yet. Colonel Richard Blackwood, the program director, commanded attention even while seated. His steel-gray hair was regulation short, his pale blue eyes calculating and unnervingly cold. At 52, he had the reputation of a man who destroyed careers with the same efficiency he'd once destroyed enemy targets. "Lieutenant Torres," Colonel Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Your performance metrics are ... unusual. Exceptional technical skills. Yet your psychological profile shows some concerning gaps in your background." Rebecca maintained perfect military posture, despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. She'd spent countless hours crafting her false identity, but she knew it wouldn't withstand intense scrutiny. "Sir, with respect, I've completed every required assessment with scores well above standard requirements. The X-47 program isn't just any assignment," Blackwood replied, leaning forward with predatory intensity. "These aircraft cost $2 billion each. They're notoriously unstable at extreme altitudes. We need pilots who can maintain perfect composure under life-or-death pressure." At the far end of the table, Dr. Marcus Fleming studied Rebecca with uncomfortable intensity. The program's chief psychologist was also one of the original designers of the aircraft's revolutionary neural adaptive interface. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected the room's harsh lights, as his gaze seemed to penetrate beyond her carefully constructed facade. "Tell me, Lieutenant," Dr. Fleming said, his voice deceptively gentle, "have you ever experienced control loss during high-stress situations? Any moments where emotion might have compromised your judgment?" A memory flashed, unbidden screaming at a flight instructor, tears streaming down her face. The news of her twin brother's death still raw and bleeding in her heart. The sympathetic looks that quickly morphed into clinical concern, then suspicion. The word "unstable" stamped in red across her file like a scarlet letter. Rebecca maintained unwavering eye contact with Dr. Fleming. "No, sir. Never." Dr. Fleming held her gaze for several long seconds, his expression suggesting he sensed the lie but was unwilling to press further. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or professional curiosity. Colonel Blackwood closed her file with a decisive snap that echoed through the silent room. "You'll begin advanced simulator training tomorrow at 0600 hours. Dr. Fleming will personally monitor your neural patterns during all exercises." His smile was sharp as a blade. "Dismissed, Lieutenant." "Thank you, sir." Rebecca saluted crisply and exited the room, maintaining perfect composure until the door closed behind her. Only then did she release a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned against the corridor wall. 5 years of meticulous planning, of buried identities and careful reinvention had led to this moment. She was back where she belonged, almost. The hardest part was just beginning. Later that evening, Rebecca walked alone through the massive hangar housing the X-47 prototype. The aircraft was unlike anything she'd ever seen: sleek, predatory lines with control surfaces that could reconfigure mid-flight to adapt to changing atmospheric conditions. Its matte black skin seemed to absorb the hangar lights rather than reflect them, giving it an almost supernatural appearance. She ran her fingers along the edge of the aircraft's wing, surprised by the warmth of the surface. The material was classified, some new composite that responded to electrical impulses like artificial muscle tissue. Beautiful, isn't she? Rebecca spun around to find Dr. Fleming watching her from several yards away. She hadn't heard him approach, despite the hangar's concrete floors. The man moved like a ghost. "Yes, sir." "Extraordinary design," she replied carefully. Dr. Fleming moved closer, his eyes focused on the aircraft rather than on her. "The X-47 doesn't just push the envelope, Lieutenant. It redefines what's possible. We've created an aircraft that hovers at the edge of instability by design. Controlled instability provides superior maneuverability," Rebecca said, unable to hide her technical knowledge. "Though it makes the aircraft nearly impossible to fly without computer assistance." Dr. Fleming's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've studied unstable aircraft dynamics?" Warning bells screamed in Rebecca's mind. She'd revealed too much. Let her expertise show through her carefully crafted mediocrity. "Just the basics from flight." "School, sir." Dr. Fleming didn't seem convinced. He turned to leave but paused at the hangar entrance. "You know, Lieutenant, the most successful test pilots aren't the ones who never experience fear or doubt. They're the ones who acknowledge those emotions, process them quickly, and continue functioning at peak performance despite them." Rebecca maintained her professional mask. "I'll keep that in mind, sir. Oh, and Lieutenant." Dr. Fleming's voice carried an unmistakable subtext. "The simulators will test more than just your technical skills tomorrow. They'll test exactly who you really are." After Dr. Fleming disappeared into the night, Rebecca stood alone with the X-47, her heart racing. His words had carried a clear message. He suspected something about her wasn't quite what it seemed. She closed her eyes, and the memories she'd fought so hard to suppress came flooding back like a dam bursting. 5 years earlier, a different flight deck, a different name. Cadet Elena Rodriguez, top of her class at the Air Force Academy, had just completed a routine training flight when her commanding officer approached with the grim expression she'd learned to associate with devastating news. Her twin brother's reconnaissance aircraft had been shot down over hostile territory. No survivors. The grief had been immediate and overwhelming, but it was her reaction during the mandatory psychological evaluation the following day that destroyed everything she'd worked for. When the base psychologist suggested she take compassionate leave to process her loss, Elena had erupted. She'd screamed that flying was the only thing keeping her sane, that grounding her would destroy her as surely as that missile had destroyed Marcus. The outburst lasted less than 60 seconds, but it was enough. Emotionally unstable, read the report. Despite her perfect academic record, despite test scores that broke academy records, despite her groundbreaking thesis on advanced spiral recovery techniques that was still being taught to cadets 5 years later, Elena Rodriguez was summarily dismissed from flight school. No appeal, no second chance. One moment of raw human grief had been deemed incompatible with the perfect emotional control required of military pilots. Rebecca opened her eyes, back in the present, her fingertips tracing the name badge on her flight suit, LTR Taurus. The false identity had taken 3 years to construct new background, altered academic records, flight certifications earned under her fabricated name. She deliberately kept her performance excellent but unremarkable, hiding the true extent of her abilities. Until now, the X-47 program represented everything she'd been working toward, the chance to prove herself again, even if no one knew who she really was. As she walked back to her quarters, Rebecca Torres prepared to bury Elena Rodriguez one final time. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Dawn came too quickly. The simulator facility was a testament to military efficiency, cold, clinically bright, and utterly devoid of personality. Rebecca sat in the mock-up cockpit, electrodes attached to her temples to measure neural responses, while the X-47's revolutionary adaptive interface learned her brain patterns. Through the simulator's wraparound screens, she could see a virtual landscape of mountains and desert valleys she would soon navigate. The technology was so advanced it felt more real than reality itself. Dr. Fleming's voice crackled through her headset, professional but carrying an undertone of intense curiosity. This simulation will test your response to progressive system failures at high altitude. Are you ready, Lieutenant? Ready, sir. The virtual X-47 responded like a dream as Rebecca put it through basic maneuvers, testing its responsiveness and limits. Despite her determination to remain unremarkable, she felt herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of flight, the joy of being airborne washing over her like a drug she'd been denied too long. Then the first system failed. Hydraulic pressure dropped on the port side, causing a slight roll that would have panicked most pilots. Rebecca compensated with textbook precision, her hands moving with practiced efficiency across the controls. Excellent correction, Dr. Fleming commented, his voice betraying nothing. Now we'll increase the difficulty. The next 30 minutes became a progressive cascade of failures, each more challenging than the last. Navigation systems went offline. Engine thrust became erratic. Control surfaces began responding with dangerous delays. Through it all, Rebecca handled each crisis with methodical precision, keeping the aircraft stable even as its systems deteriorated. Around her, in the observation room, Colonel Blackwood watched Rebecca's performance with growing interest. "She's good," he murmured to Dr. Fleming. "Very good." Dr. Fleming nodded, his attention fixed on the neural pattern display streaming across multiple monitors. "Too good, perhaps." Meaning? Her responses show advanced pattern recognition. She's anticipating system failures before warning lights. Up here, Dr. Fleming adjusted his glasses, his scientific mind processing troubling data. It suggests prior experience with similar scenarios that shouldn't exist in her official record. Colonel Blackwood frowned. Her file shows standard flight training. Nothing specialized. No, it doesn't. Dr. Fleming's fingers moved across his keyboard, pulling up archived files he'd hoped never to access again. "Colonel, I took the liberty of running her neural response patterns through our classified database. That's not standard protocol. No, it isn't. But look at this." Dr. Fleming pointed to two identical waveform patterns displayed side by side on his screen. The left pattern is Lieutenant Torres' response to crisis situations. The right is from our archives of exceptional pilots. Colonel Blackwood leaned closer, his expression darkening. They're nearly identical. Not merely, exactly. The right-hand pattern belongs to Cadet Elena Rodriguez, recorded 5 years ago during her final year at the Academy. Colonel Blackwood straightened abruptly, recognition flooding his features. Rodriguez, the one who was dismissed for emotional instability. The most promising pilot of her generation until that single psychological break, Dr. Fleming confirmed quietly. And unless I'm very much mistaken, she's sitting in our simulator right now. In the cockpit, unaware of the conversation then, would determine her fate. Rebecca was fully immersed in the simulation. The scenario had escalated to critical failure, multiple systems offline, the aircraft entering an uncontrolled spiral dive toward a mountainous region. Standard recovery procedures weren't working. The virtual X-47 continued its death spiral, altitude dropping rapidly toward the unforgiving peaks below. Rebecca felt sweat beading on her forehead, but her hands remained steady on the controls. A memory surfaced her academy thesis on advanced spiral recovery techniques, the theoretical maneuver she'd designed, but never had the chance to test in a real aircraft. The Kasnov reversal. Named after a legendary Russian aerobatics pioneer, it existed only in theory and computer models. No pilot had successfully executed it in a real aircraft in over 25 years. Most considered it impossible. Without conscious decision, Rebecca's hands began moving through the precise sequence. It was a counterintuitive combination of throttle adjustments and control inputs that initially made the spiral worse, using the aircraft's own momentum against it before redirecting that energy into controlled flight. In the control room, alarms sounded as the simulator detected the unusual inputs. "What is she doing?" Colonel Blackwood demanded. Dr. Fleming's eyes widened in recognition and something approaching awe. "She's attempting the Kasnov reversal." On the external monitors, they watched as the virtual X-47's descent initially worsened, plummeting toward the digital mountains with terrifying speed. Then, impossibly, the aircraft began to respond. Its deadly trajectory shifted from uncontrolled spiral to controlled descent, then to level flight. "My God," Colonel Blackwood whispered. "She actually did it." Dr. Fleming's expression mixed vindication with profound respect. Only one pilot ever theorized that maneuver in detail, and now we know for certain who's in that cockpit. In the simulator, Rebecca completed the recovery, bringing the aircraft to stable flight. Her heart pounded, but her breathing remained controlled. She'd done it. The theoretical maneuver she'd designed years ago had worked, even if only in simulation. The communication system remained silent for several long seconds. Then Dr. Fleming's voice came through, unusually gentle. "Excellent work, Lieutenant. Simulation complete. Please report to Briefing Room A immediately." Rebecca removed the neural sensors with trembling fingers. She knew what had happened. In the heat of the moment, she'd revealed herself completely. The Kasnov reversal was her signature, described in exhaustive detail in Elena Rodriguez's thesis. No other pilot would attempt it, let alone execute it flawlessly. Her deception was over. As she walked down the corridor toward Briefing Room A, Rebecca straightened her shoulders with quiet dignity. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her head held high. She'd proven what she'd set out to prove, that she belonged in that cockpit. That one emotional moment didn't define her abilities or her worth. The door to her future or her final military disgrace waited at the end of the hall. Rebecca hesitated outside Briefing Room A, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Whatever happened next would determine whether she had any future in aviation or if she'd spend the next decade in military prison for identity fraud. Taking a deep breath that felt like her last as a free woman, she pushed open the door. To her surprise, the room was empty except for Dr. Fleming, who sat alone at the briefing table studying data on a military-grade tablet. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable behind those perpetual wire-rimmed glasses. "Lieutenant Torres," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." Rebecca sat stiffly, maintaining perfect military posture. "Sir, I can explain." Dr. Fleming held up a hand. "In a moment. First, I want to discuss what happened in the simulator." He turned the tablet toward her, showing the precise flight path of her simulated recovery. "This maneuver, the Kasnov reversal. Tell me how you knew it would work." Rebecca weighed her options quickly. Lying further seemed not only pointless, but insulting to both their intelligence. "I designed it, sir. In theory, it exploits the inherent instability of the spiral to generate counteracting momentum through controlled acceleration." Yes, I... No. Dr. Fleming's eyes held hers steadily. "I was on the review committee for Cadet Elena Rodriguez's thesis 5 years ago. It was brilliant work, never practically tested until today." The silence between them stretched like a taut wire. Rebecca knew she should say something, But words seemed inadequate to bridge the chasm between her deception and this moment of truth. Your false identity was impressively thorough. Dr. Fleming continued conversationally, as if discussing weather rather than career-ending fraud. New identification, altered service records, even subtle cosmetic changes to your appearance. What I can't understand is why Colonel Blackwood hasn't joined us yet. I sent him the neural pattern comparison 20 minutes ago. Rebecca's stomach dropped like she was in free fall. You knew? I suspected from our first meeting. You have very distinctive eye movement patterns when processing complex flight data like a fingerprint, really. Dr. Fleming set down his tablet with deliberate care. The question is, what happens now? Before Rebecca could respond, her secure communication device buzzed with an emergency alert that made her blood run cold. She glanced down at the message, then back at Dr. Fleming, confusion evident on her face. That's the emergency scramble for the X-47 test flight, she said slowly. But that wasn't scheduled until next week. Dr. Fleming checked his own device, his expression shifting from academic curiosity to genuine concern. Weather patterns shifted unexpectedly. There's a narrow window opening for high-altitude testing. Colonel Blackwood is already at the flight line. He stood quickly, his scientific demeanor replaced by military urgency. We'll continue this discussion later. For now, you're still on the roster as Primary Systems Officer. Lieutenant Jake Morrison is pilot in command. Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and disappointment crash over her simultaneously. She'd be in the cockpit, but not as the pilot. Still, it was infinitely better than immediate arrest for identity fraud. Yes, sir. She stood, snapping to attention with muscle memory honed over years of training. Dr. Fleming paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Lieutenant, regardless of who you were or who you are now, you're the most qualified person for this flight. Don't hold back today. 20 minutes later, Rebecca strode across the flight line in her pressure suit, helmet tucked under her arm. The X-47 gleamed menacingly in the morning sun, its black surface drinking in light like a predator waiting to strike. Ground crews swarmed around it in final preparation, their movements choreographed with military precision. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, the designated test pilot, waited at the base of the boarding ladder. At 28, he was younger than Rebecca, but had earned his position through exceptional reflexes and unshakable composure. Torres, he acknowledged with a professional nod. Ready for this? Rebecca nodded, pushing down the complex emotions threatening to surface. She'd trained with Morrison in simulators for weeks. He was good steady, by the book, with reaction. Times that tested at the 99th percentile. But she knew the X-47 systems better than anyone, having studied the theoretical designs for years before her dismissal. Weather systems moving in faster than expected, Morrison explained as they climbed into the cramped cockpit. Command wants high-altitude performance data before conditions deteriorate. The cockpit was a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. Rebecca's position, slightly behind and to Morrison's right, controlled all major aircraft systems while Morrison handled primary flight controls. The experimental neural interface would connect to both of them, allowing the aircraft to anticipate pilot needs based on brainwave patterns. Pre-flight checks completed without incident. The canopy sealed with a pneumatic hiss that always reminded Rebecca of a coffin closing, though today she pushed that morbid thought aside. This was where she belonged, regardless of the name on her uniform. X-47, this is Control, came Colonel Blackwood's voice over the COM system, crisp with authority. You are cleared for takeoff. Maintain heading 270 after departure. Climb to test altitude 45,000 feet. Control, X-47 copies. Taking off now. Morrison's hands were steady and sure as the X-47's experimental engines ignited, with a deep rumble that Rebecca felt through her entire body. The thrust pushed them back into their seats as the aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifting off. With surprising grace for such an advanced, inherently unstable design. The ground fell away rapidly as they climbed through 10,000 feet. The familiar sensation of leaving Earth behind filling Rebecca with a peace she'd almost forgotten existed. In the command center, Dr. Fleming watched telemetry data streaming across multiple screens, his scientific mind cataloging every parameter, while his conscience wrestled with what he knew about the woman in that cockpit. "Systems nominal," he reported to Colonel Blackwood. "Neural interface functioning at optimal levels." Colonel Blackwood nodded curtly, then lowered his voice. "We need to discuss Lieutenant Torres after this flight. Your message mentioned urgent matters," Dr. Fleming replied carefully. "Later," Blackwood said, his eyes fixed on the flight data. "Let's focus on the test flight first." At 30,000 feet, Rebecca monitored the aircraft systems as they continued their climb toward the edge of space. Everything functioned perfectly, the experimental aircraft proving remarkably stable despite its cutting-edge design that pushed every boundary of aeronautical engineering. "Systems performing within expected parameters," she reported professionally. "Neural interface calibrated and responding normally." Morrison nodded, his hands confident on the controls. "She flies like a dream, approaching test altitude." As they leveled off at 45,000 feet, the X-47 sliced through air so thin it barely qualified as atmosphere. Above them, the sky darkened to deep blue, and the curvature of Earth became visible at the horizon, a reminder of how far they'd pushed beyond normal human experience. X-47, begin systems check protocol, came Flight Director Walsh's voice from control. Rebecca began the methodical sequence, testing each system and reporting results with the precision that had made her legendary at the Academy. Her movements were economical, efficient, the product of thousands of hours of training and natural talent that couldn't be taught or faked. In the command center, Dr. Fleming watched her technique with growing certainty. There was no doubt in his mind. Now her neural patterns, visible on his private monitoring screen, matched exactly with Elena Rodriguez's archived records. "Dr. Fleming," one of the engineers called urgently, "I'm seeing unusual readings from the primary stabilization system." Fleming moved quickly to the engineer's station, studying the data with professional alarm. A cold weight settled in his stomach as he cross-referenced the readings with redundant sensors. "Could be sensor malfunction," Colonel Blackwood said, joining them. "Or it could be actual system degradation. Either way, we need to alert the crew," Fleming said, reaching for the communication console. Before he could key the microphone, alarms began blaring across the command center as multiple warning lights flashed red across every monitoring station. "Primary stabilization failure," the flight engineer shouted over the chaos. "They're losing control authority." In the X-47, Rebecca's training took over as warning indicators flashed across her console like deadly Christmas lights. Her hands flew over the controls, rapidly assessing the cascading failures that threatened to turn their experimental aircraft into a 40,000-foot coffin. The real test, the one that would determine everything, had just begun. Primary stabilization. "System failing," Rebecca reported with professional calm, even as her heart rate spiked. Her hands moved across the control panels with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding her through emergency procedures she drilled thousands of times, switching to backup systems. Morrison fought the flight controls as the X-47 began to shudder violently, its experimental design suddenly working against them. The aircraft, that had seemed so graceful moments before, now felt like a wild animal trying to throw them from its back. "Control, X-47. Morrison's voice remained steady despite the growing crisis. "Aircraft becoming unstable. Request immediate emergency descent clearance." "X-47, this is Control. Flight Director Walsh responded, tension crackling through the radio. You are cleared for emergency descent. Engage backup systems and prepare for immediate return to base. Rebecca's fingers danced across her console as she engaged the backup stabilization systems, but her screens immediately showed insufficient response. The X-47 began to roll unpredictably, entering the early stages of what she recognized with growing dread as a developing spiral. Backup systems engaged, but insufficient, she reported, her voice cutting through the cockpit alarms. Lieutenant Morrison suggests reducing altitude immediately to increase control effectiveness. Morrison nodded grimly, pushing the aircraft into a controlled descent. But as they passed through 40,000 feet, he suddenly gasped and slumped forward in his harness. Rebecca's blood turned to ice. She reached forward, checking Morrison's pulse strong, but he was completely unconscious. Likely a rapid pressure change in the cockpit had affected him but not her, possibly due to their different seating positions or individual physiology. The X-47, now without active pilot control, began to pitch downward more steeply, its sophisticated systems unable to compensate for the primary stabilization failure. Control, this is Lieutenant Torres, Rebecca called urgently, taking primary flight control. Lieutenant Morrison is unconscious. I have flight controls. In the command center, panic erupted like a disturbed hornet's nest. She can't fly that thing alone with compromised systems, Colonel Blackwood said, his face draining of color. The neural interface is calibrated specifically to Morrison's brain patterns. Dr. Fleming moved to the main communication console, his scientific mind already calculating possibilities. Lieutenant Torres, this is Dr. Fleming. You need to engage autopilot return protocol immediately. Negative, sir. Rebecca's voice came back with eerie calm that sent chills through everyone listening. Autopilot requires primary stabilization. System, request permission for manual recovery attempt. The room erupted in alarmed voices as controllers exchanged glances filled with barely controlled fear. That's suicide at this altitude with compromised systems, Colonel Blackwood exclaimed, his military composure cracking under the pressure. Dr. Fleming studied the flight path projections streaming across his screens. The data painted a terrifying picture. The X-47 was entering what could become an unrecoverable spiral. With the primary systems damaged as they were, conventional recovery methods would fail completely. Let her try, he said quietly, scientific certainty building in his voice. Are you insane? Colonel Blackwood demanded. She's the only pilot alive who can save that aircraft, Fleming insisted, his eyes fixed on the neural pattern displays. That told him everything he needed to know about who was really in that cockpit. He keyed the microphone. Lieutenant Torres, you are cleared for manual recovery. Do whatever you need to do. In the cockpit, 40,000 feet above the unforgiving desert, Rebecca felt a strange sense of destiny settle over her. She was back in her element, facing impossible odds with only her skill, knowledge, and will to live standing between her and catastrophe. The X-47 continued its spiral descent, passing through 35,000 feet as warning systems screamed and G-forces built. Rebecca quickly adjusted Morrison's harness to keep him secure, then focused entirely on the challenge of her life. She began the sequence of control inputs that she'd theorized years ago, but never tested outside of simulation, the Kasnov reversal. The aircraft initially responded by worsening its spiral, exactly as her calculations had predicted. In the command center, engineers watched in horror as the X-47's descent rate increased dramatically. What is she doing? Someone shouted over the alarm bells. Dr. Fleming leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the trajectory data with the intensity of a man witnessing history. Wait for it, he murmured. Rebecca continued the precise sequence of inputs, feeling the experimental aircraft respond to her commands despite its damaged systems. The neural interface, designed to adapt to pilot brain patterns, began syncing with her patterns instead of Morrison's unconscious ones. The X-47 seemed to come alive under her touch, as if recognizing a kindred spirit, an entity balanced on the edge of control and chaos, just like herself. Gradually, impossibly, the spiral began to slow. The aircraft's descent rate decreased as Rebecca worked through her theoretical maneuver with real-world precision. The X-47's sophisticated but damaged systems responded to her inputs like a concert, piano responding to a master musician's touch. As she completed the maneuver sequence, the aircraft transitioned smoothly from uncontrolled spiral to level flight at 20,000 feet. The X-47 was once again under complete control, despite its damaged primary systems. The command center erupted in spontaneous applause and cheers that echoed off the sterile walls. "She did it," Colonel Blackwood whispered, awe evident in his voice. "That should have been impossible." "Not impossible," Dr. Fleming corrected quietly, his eyes bright with vindication. "Just never successfully executed by anyone except its theoretical creator." "The Kasnov reversal," the flight engineer said, recognition dawning in his voice. "That was Elena Rodriguez's theoretical maneuver from her academy thesis. But no one's ever actually performed it successfully in flight. Until now," Dr. Fleming said, his gaze fixed on the stable flight path displayed across the main screen. Colonel Blackwood turned to him sharply. "Fleming, what exactly are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that Lieutenant Rebecca Torres doesn't exist," Dr. Fleming said with quiet certainty. "That aircraft is being flown by Captain Elena Rodriguez. On Rebecca's comm system." Flight Director Walsh's voice came through thick with relief and barely controlled emotion. "Lieutenant Torres, status report." Rebecca checked her instruments methodically, noting that all remaining systems were functioning within acceptable parameters. Morrison was beginning to stir beside her, consciousness slowly returning. "Aircraft stable, sir," she replied with professional composure. "Lieutenant Morrison is recovering, requesting clearance to land." As the X-47 approached the runway, Rebecca felt a profound sense of completion. Her deception was over. The maneuver had revealed her true identity, as surely as if she'd announced it over the radio. But she had saved the aircraft, saved Morrison's life, and proven beyond any doubt that she belonged in that cockpit. She brought the experimental aircraft down with textbook precision, touching down gently despite the damaged primary systems. As the X-47 taxied to a stop, emergency crews rushed forward while Rebecca completed shutdown procedures. Removing her helmet, she turned to check on Morrison, who was now fully conscious but disoriented. "Torres," he mumbled, confusion evident in his voice. "What happened?" "Systems failure." "You lost consciousness." "We made it back," she kept her explanation. Simple as medical personnel helped him from the cockpit. As Rebecca descended the aircraft ladder, she saw a line of senior officers waiting on the tarmac. Dr. Fleming stood at the front, his expression mixing professional respect with personal vindication. Behind him stood Colonel Blackwood and several others, some of whom she recognized as members of the original board that had destroyed her career 5 years ago. This was her moment of truth. The end of Rebecca Torres and the final judgment of Elena Rodriguez. She squared her shoulders and stepped forward to face her past, her future, and the consequences of the most perfect flight of her life. Rebecca stood at perfect attention before the line of senior officers, her posture flawless despite the exhaustion beginning to set in after the emergency. The flight suit still read "Otr Torres," but she knew that identity had evaporated the moment she executed the Kasnov reversal. Dr. Fleming stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but carrying something that looked remarkably like respect. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, using her real rank and name. The words hit her like a physical blow. It had been 5 years since anyone had called her that. 5 years of hiding, of being someone else, of suppressing everything that made her exceptional. "It's Lieutenant Torres now, sir," she replied automatically, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Not anymore." Dr. Fleming extended his hand, not for a handshake, but holding something that caught the desert sunlight. It was a set of pilot wings, her original ones, issued at the academy graduation, with her real name engraved on the back in precise military lettering. Rebecca Lena stared at them in disbelief. "I don't understand, sir." "The aviation Corps owes you an apology, Captain," Dr. Fleming continued, his voice carrying the weight of institutional regret. "And I personally owe you more than that." Behind him, the senior officers, including those who had been on the board that dismissed her, snapped to attention simultaneously and rendered a crisp salute. It was the highest gesture of respect one military officer could show another, and Elena felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack under its implications. "Sir, my dismissal," she began, was a grieving sister reacting to news of her brother's death. Colonel Blackwood interrupted, stepping forward. His earlier coldness had been replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Not an unstable pilot. We made a catastrophic error 5 years ago." Dr. Fleming gestured toward the X-47, now surrounded by technicians and investigators. "What you just accomplished was theoretically impossible, Captain. You saved a $2 billion aircraft and Lieutenant Morrison's life using a maneuver that existed only in theory, your theory. The neural readings don't lie," added the chief flight engineer, approaching with a tablet full of data. "We've had your original neural patterns on file since your academy days. They match perfectly with today's readings, and they show something remarkable." Elena waited, hardly daring to breathe. "Your emotional responses during crisis situations are actually more stable than 95% of pilots we've ever tested," Dr. Fleming explained. "What we interpreted as instability 5 years ago was actually rapid emotional processing, the ability to experience grief, acknowledge it, and continue functioning at peak performance." Colonel Blackwood cleared his throat, his military bearing, unable to completely hide his discomfort with what he had to say next. "Captain Rodriguez, what you did was also technically illegal. Identity fraud, falsifying military records, these are serious federal offenses." Elena straightened her shoulders, preparing for the consequences she'd always known might come. "Yes, sir. I understand." "However," Blackwood continued, "in light of the extraordinary circumstances and your actions today, those charges are being set aside. Your original commission is being reinstated with immediate promotion to captain, effective retroactively from 5 years ago." Elena stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "Sir, your back pay and benefits will be calculated accordingly," Colonel Blackwood added, the hint of a smile finally breaking through his stern demeanor. "Though I imagine the paperwork will be a nightmare for someone in administration." For the first time in 5 years, Elena felt a genuine smile spread across her face. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," Blackwood replied. "You have significant work ahead of you. The X-47 program needs a new head test pilot, now that you've demonstrated what that aircraft is truly capable of." Dr. Fleming handed her the wings, which she accepted with slightly trembling fingers. The weight of them in her palm felt like coming home after an impossible journey. "Captain Rodriguez," he said formally, "do you accept this position?" Elena's smile broadened as she pinned the wings to her flight suit, replacing the false name tag with her real identity. "Yes, sir, I do." "Excellent." Fleming extended his hand for a proper handshake. "Welcome back." As they shook hands, Dr. Fleming lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Your brother would be proud." Elena felt tears threaten for the first time since the day she'd lost everything but she managed to hold them back. This time, showing emotion wouldn't be held against her, but old habits died hard. Permission to remain with the X-47 program. Sir? She asked Colonel Blackwood formally. Permission granted. In fact, we're putting you in charge of pilot training. Your understanding of the aircraft systems and handling characteristics is unmatched. The medical team had finished examining Lieutenant Morrison, who was now walking toward them under his own power, looking confused but alert. What's happening? He asked, glancing between Elena and the senior officers. Colonel Blackwood turned to him with barely concealed amusement. Lieutenant Morrison, meet Captain Elena Rodriguez, your new commanding officer. Morrison's eyebrows shot up in recognition. Rodriguez? The same Rodriguez who wrote the advanced spiral recovery paper we studied at the academy. The very same. Dr. Fleming confirmed. Morrison looked at Elena with new appreciation and no small amount of awe. You saved my life up there. That maneuver, I didn't think it was actually possible to execute in real conditions. Neither did anyone else, Elena replied with a small smile. That was its first real-world test. Morrison shook his head in amazement. Well, I'm glad you chose my flight to prove it works, Captain. As the group began walking toward the debriefing center, Elena felt a profound shift in her reality. For 5 years, she had lived as someone else, suppressing her true abilities, hiding her brilliance behind a facade of competent mediocrity. Now she could finally be herself again, could finally reclaim not just her name, but her full potential. The debriefing session was extensive and thorough. Engineers and flight analysts pored over every second of data from the emergency, asking Elena to walk them through her decision-making process with the intensity of scientists studying a new form of life. The Kasnov reversal would now move from theoretical possibility to documented recovery technique, potentially saving countless lives in future emergencies. The key insight, Elena explained to the rapt audience, projecting flight data onto the main screen, is understanding that certain types of instability can actually be leveraged to generate controlled momentum. Most pilots instinctively try to fight the spiral directly, which depletes their energy and control authority. But the G-forces involved, one engineer objected, studying the stress readings. The structural stress on the airframe are within design tolerances if executed precisely, Elena finished. That's why it requires such exact timing. Half a second too late, and the spiral becomes truly unrecoverable. Dr. Fleming watched from the back of the room with deep satisfaction. This was what should have happened 5 years ago. Elena Rodriguez sharing her revolutionary insights with colleagues who could appreciate her brilliance, rather than being dismissed for showing human emotion in the face of devastating loss. After the formal debriefing, as the room cleared, Colonel Blackwood approached Elena with a military-grade tablet. Your new security clearance and credentials are being processed. You'll need to update your biometrics. She placed her palm on the scanner, then allowed it to capture her retinal pattern. The screen flashed green, then displayed her official military record, now showing her real name, with all commendations restored and the dismissal completely expunged from her permanent file. Thank you, sir, she said quietly. Colonel Blackwood hesitated, clearly struggling with something personal. Captain, I owe you an individual apology. I was on the board that dismissed you 5 years ago. Elena looked at him with surprise, seeing the man behind the military facade for the first time. We were wrong, he continued with obvious difficulty. We confused emotional expression with emotional instability. The military has evolved since then. We've learned that perfect stoicism isn't always the most valuable quality in a pilot. Sometimes the ability to process emotion quickly and move forward is more important than never showing feeling at all. Elena nodded, accepting his apology without need for words. Some wounds were too deep for simple explanations. But this was a beginning. "Your new quarters are being prepared," Blackwood added, returning to safer professional ground. "Tomorrow at 0800, I'd like you to begin developing a comprehensive training program for the X-47. We'll need more pilots who can handle its unique characteristics, especially now that we understand what it's truly capable of." "Yes, sir." As Colonel Blackwood left, Elena found herself alone in the briefing room, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. From the verge of exposure and disgrace to reinstatement and promotion, all in the span of a few hours. It was almost too much to process. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Lieutenant Morrison stood there, now wearing his standard uniform rather than his flight suit. "Captain," he said with respectful formality, "some of us are heading to the officers' club. Thought you might want to join us, to celebrate not dying today." Elena hesitated. For 5 years, she'd kept everyone at arm's length, afraid that getting too close would risk her secret being discovered. But that need for isolation was over now. "Actually," she said, making a decision that felt like stepping into sunlight, "after years in shadow, I'd like that very much." The officers' club was buzzing with energy when they arrived. Word had spread quickly about the emergency and the extraordinary recovery, and as Elena entered with Morrison, conversations paused momentarily before resuming with increased intensity. A young lieutenant approached hesitantly. "Captain Rodriguez? I studied your theoretical work at the academy. It's an honor to meet you." Before Elena could respond, another pilot joined them. "Is it true you designed the Kasnov reversal as a cadet and then actually executed it today?" Suddenly, she was surrounded by fellow pilots, all asking questions and expressing genuine admiration. There was no suspicion in their eyes, no judgment. About her past deception, only professional respect and curiosity. For the first time in 5 years, Elena allowed herself to engage fully, explaining her theories without reservation, laughing at appropriate moments, being truly present rather than constantly vigilant. It felt like breathing freely after years. Underwater. Later that evening, she stood alone by the club's large window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Dr. Fleming joined her, offering a glass of water. "How does it feel?" he asked simply. "Being yourself again?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Strange," she admitted. "Wonderful. Terrifying." "Terrifying? I spent so long being careful, being less than I could be. Now there are no more excuses, no more hiding. It's all on me." Dr. Fleming nodded with understanding. "The X-47 was designed to function at the edge of instability, Captain. That's where it performs best. Where other aircraft would fail, it excels. Perhaps some pilots are the same way." Elena smiled at the comparison. "Maybe so. One more thing," Dr. Fleming said, reaching into his pocket. "This was recovered from your original file." He handed her a small photograph, creased and worn from handling. It showed Elena and her twin brother Marcus in their flight suits, arms around each other's shoulders, both laughing at something outside the frame. "Thank you," she whispered, her vision blurring slightly for the second time that day. This time, she didn't fight the emotion. The next morning brought a new beginning. Elena rose early, her mind already racing with plans for the X-47 training program. Her new quarters had been prepared as promised, her few possessions moved from Rebecca Torres' smaller room. On the desk sat her official reinstatement papers, her captain's bars, and a new name badge. Capt. E. Rodriguez. She picked it up, running her thumb over the engraved letters that represented her true identity restored. 5 years ago, she had been labeled unstable after one emotional outburst and dismissed from the program that meant everything to her. She'd rebuilt her life from nothing, created a new identity, and fought her way back to where she belonged. As she pinned the badge to her uniform and headed toward the flight line where the X-47 waited, Elena reflected on the strange symmetry of her journey. The very qualities that had once been used against her intensity, her passion, her willingness to push boundaries, were now recognized as essential to her excellence. The hangar doors were open to the morning sun, and flight crews parted respectfully as she walked toward the aircraft that had changed everything. The X-47 gleamed in the light, its design balanced perfectly between stability and instability, just like her. Elena placed her hand on the aircraft's warm surface, feeling the connection between them. Both had been misunderstood, both pushed to their limits, both vindicated through crisis. Captain Rodriguez called a technician, approaching with a tablet. The modifications you requested for the neural interface training protocols are ready for your review. Elena smiled, the expression feeling natural for the first time in years. Thank you. Let's get started. The day stretched before her, full of possibility. There would be new pilots to train, new boundaries to push, new techniques to develop. After 5 years in the shadows, Captain Elena Rodriguez was finally back where she belonged, not just in the cockpit, but at the forefront of aviation, where the air was thinnest and only the most exceptional could survive. She was exactly where she was meant to be, balanced on the beautiful, powerful edge between stability and instability, where true excellence lived. 3 weeks after her reinstatement, Captain Elena Rodriguez stood before a conference room filled with the Air Force's most promising young pilots. 12 handpicked aviators, each representing the top 1% of their respective classes, sat in attention as she prepared to begin the most challenging training program in military aviation. The X-47 Advanced Pilot Training Initiative was her creation, a comprehensive program designed to identify and develop pilots capable of handling the most unstable aircraft ever built. But not everyone was convinced it would work. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena began, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd earned through both triumph and adversity. You're here because standard training has reached its limits. The X-47 requires something beyond conventional pilot skills. Among the 12 candidates, she recognized several standouts. Captain David Park, whose simulation scores were nearly perfect. Lieutenant Amanda Walsh, whose psychological evaluations showed exceptional stress tolerance. And Captain Michael Torres, no relation to her former identity, whose theoretical knowledge of advanced aerodynamics rivaled her own. But it was the pilot in the back row who concerned her most. Major Richard Blackwood, Jr., son of Colonel Blackwood, sat with his arms crossed and an expression that barely concealed his skepticism. At 31, he was older than most candidates and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never failed at anything important. Major Blackwood, Elena addressed him directly. Do you have questions about the program structure? Actually, yes, Captain, he replied, his tone respectful but challenging. I've reviewed your theoretical work, and while impressive in simulation, I question whether such extreme maneuvers have practical application. The Kasnov reversal, for instance, it seems unnecessarily risky when conventional recovery techniques exist. The room fell silent. Elena recognized the challenge for what it was, not just professional skepticism, but a test of her authority. Major Blackwood represented the old guard of military aviation, conservative, risk-averse, suspicious of innovation. That's an excellent point, Major, Elena replied calmly. Would you care to demonstrate conventional recovery techniques in today's simulation? Major Blackwood's confident smile faltered slightly. Of course, Captain. 2 hours later, in the advanced flight simulator, Major Blackwood was struggling. Elena had programmed a scenario identical to her emergency 3 weeks earlier, cascading system failures at high altitude, with the aircraft entering an unrecoverable spiral using conventional methods. Through the observation window, the other Candidates watched as Major Blackwood fought the controls, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He was an excellent pilot by traditional standards, but the X-47's unique characteristics were beyond his experience. Conventional recovery isn't working, Captain Park observed quietly. He's losing altitude too fast. The aircraft's inherent. Instability makes standard techniques ineffective, Lieutenant Walsh added, her engineering background evident in her analysis. In the simulator, Major Blackwood finally gave up, allowing the virtual aircraft to crash into the digital mountainside. He emerged from the cockpit frustrated and slightly embarrassed. "The scenario is unrealistic," he said defensively. "No aircraft would experience that many simultaneous failures." Elena activated the large display screen, showing real flight data from her emergency 3 weeks earlier. "This is the actual data from test flight 47-7. Lieutenant Morrison and I experienced exactly this scenario." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as the candidates realized they were looking at real emergency data, not simulation parameters. "Major Blackwood," Elena continued, "you'll notice that conventional recovery techniques failed completely. The X-47's design makes traditional approaches not just ineffective, but dangerous." She advanced to the next data screen, showing her successful recovery. The Casino reversal worked because it uses the aircraft's instability as an asset rather than fighting against it. Major Blackwood studied the data with growing respect and grudging admiration. I didn't realize this was based on actual flight experience. Everything we'll train on in this program comes from real-world testing," Elena explained to the group. "The X-47 isn't just an advanced aircraft. It's a complete paradigm shift in how we think about controlled flight." Over the following days, Elena put the candidates through increasingly challenging scenarios. Some adapted quickly to her unconventional methods, while others struggled with concepts that challenged everything they'd learned about aviation. Captain Park excelled at the technical aspects, but showed hesitation when faced with counterintuitive control inputs. Lieutenant Walsh demonstrated exceptional understanding of the theory, but needed work on rapid decision-making under pressure. Major Blackwood, despite his initial skepticism, proved to be one of the most adaptable students. Once he accepted that his previous training was insufficient for the X-47's unique demands. But it was Captain Michael Torres who surprised everyone. During a particularly challenging simulation involving multiple system failures and severe weather, Torres executed a modified version of the Kasnov reversal that Elena had never seen before. It was theoretically sound but incorporated elements she hadn't considered. "Where did you learn that variation?" she asked after the simulation ended. "I didn't learn it," Torres replied, his Hispanic accent slight but noticeable. "I developed it while studying your original thesis. I thought the traditional approach could be improved for certain atmospheric conditions." Elena stared at him with growing excitement. "Show me your calculations." Torres produced a worn notebook filled with complex mathematical equations and aerodynamic diagrams. His theoretical work was sophisticated, creative, and absolutely brilliant. "Have you tested this in simulation?" Elena asked. "No, Captain. I didn't want to presumptively modify your work without permission." Elena smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd worn since beginning the training program. "Captain Torres, innovation isn't presumption. It's evolution. I want you to run full simulations of your modifications immediately." Word of the new training program's unusual methods began to spread throughout the base, attracting both attention and criticism. Some senior officers worried that Elena's unconventional approaches were too risky, while others argued that the X-47's revolutionary capabilities required equally revolutionary training methods. The debate came to a head during the third week of training, when General Patricia Williams, commander of the Experimental Aircraft Division, arrived for an unannounced inspection. General Williams was a legend in military aviation, the first woman to command a fighter squadron, with a reputation for both tactical brilliance and uncompromising standards. At 55, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd broken barriers and faced down every challenge the military could offer. Elena had never met General Williams personally, but she knew her reputation. This inspection would determine the future of both the training program and her own military career. "Captain Rodriguez," General Williams said as Elena reported to the makeshift briefing room. "I've been hearing interesting reports about your training methods." "Yes, ma'am. We're developing techniques specifically designed for the X-47's unique characteristics." General Williams studied Elena with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through careful facades. "Some of my colleagues are concerned that you're teaching dangerous techniques to impressionable young pilots." Elena felt her stomach tighten, but she maintained professional composure. "General, the X-47 itself is inherently dangerous. Our training reflects that reality." "Show me," General Williams said simply. For the next 2 hours, Elena demonstrated her training program, walking General Williams through the theoretical foundations, simulation protocols, and actual flight data that supported her methods. The general asked probing questions that revealed both deep knowledge and healthy skepticism. Finally, General Williams asked to observe a live training session. Elena selected Captain Torres and Major Blackwood for a complex dual-pilot scenario involving emergency formation flying with compromised systems. As the two pilots worked through the challenging simulation, General Williams watched with the intensity of a scientist studying a new species. Both men performed flawlessly, using techniques that would have been considered impossible just months earlier. "Impressive," General Williams murmured as the simulation concluded. "But I want to see the instructor's capabilities personally." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "Ma'am, I want you to demonstrate the Kasnov reversal. In actual flight, not simulation." The request was both an honor and a potential death sentence. Flying the maneuver in a real aircraft, even under controlled conditions, carried enormous risk. But refusing would likely end both her career and the training program. "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied without hesitation. "When would you like to schedule the demonstration?" General Williams smiled for the first time since arriving. "Tomorrow morning. And Captain?" "Yes, ma'am." "I'll be your observer. If you're willing to risk your life for these techniques, I'm willing to risk mine to evaluate them." Elena felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration as she realized that everything she'd worked for, her reinstatement, her training program, her future, would be decided in a single flight with the most influential woman in military aviation sitting behind her. The real test was just beginning. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Edwards Air Force Base as Elena completed her pre-flight preparations. Today's demonstration flight would determine not just the future of her training program, but potentially the direction of military aviation for the next decade. General Williams arrived at the flight line precisely on schedule, wearing a flight suit that bore the insignia of someone who had personally tested dozens of experimental aircraft over a distinguished career. At 55, she moved with the confident economy of motion that marked truly exceptional pilots. "Captain Rodriguez," she acknowledged with a crisp nod. "Ready to show me what the future of aviation looks like?" "Yes, ma'am." Elena gestured toward the X-47, which gleamed ominously in the morning sun. "We'll climb to 35,000 feet, and I'll demonstrate controlled spiral recovery under progressively challenging conditions." General Williams studied the aircraft with professional appreciation. "I've read your technical reports, but I want to understand the practical applications. How does the Kasnov reversal translate to real combat or emergency situations?" The technique isn't just about spiral recovery, General. It's about fundamentally changing how pilots interact with unstable aircraft. Instead of fighting instability, we learned to channel it. They climbed into the X-47's cockpit, Elena in the pilot's position, while General Williams took the observer seat that Lieutenant Morrison had occupied 3 weeks earlier. The general's presence behind her was both reassuring and intimidating. Here was someone who truly understood the risks they were taking. X-47, this is Control, came the familiar voice of Flight Director Walsh. You are cleared for takeoff. Maintain heading 090. Climb to test altitude. Control, X-47 copies. Taking off now. The experimental aircraft lifted off with its characteristic grace, climbing rapidly through the thin desert air. Elena felt the familiar calm settle over her as they left the ground behind. This was where she belonged, where her skills and knowledge could be fully utilized without pretense or limitation. At 20,000 feet, General Williams spoke through the intercom. I've flown experimental aircraft for 30 years, Captain. I've never seen anything that handles quite like this. The X-47 is designed to be controllable instability, Elena replied, putting the aircraft through a series of gentle maneuvers to demonstrate its capabilities. Most aircraft seek stability as their default state. This one uses instability as a tool, like flying a controlled explosion, General Williams observed. Exactly. As they leveled off at 35,000 feet, Elena began the formal demonstration. I'll start with a standard spiral entry, then show recovery using conventional techniques versus the Kasnov method. She induced a mild spiral using traditional control inputs, then demonstrated standard recovery procedures. The X-47 responded adequately but required significant altitude loss and precise timing. Now, I'll show you the same scenario with primary stabilization compromised, Elena announced, switching off key systems to simulate the emergency conditions she'd faced 3 weeks earlier. The aircraft immediately became more challenging to control, its inherent instability magnified by the system failures. Elena induced another spiral, this one more aggressive and realistic. Conventional recovery techniques, she narrated, attempting standard procedures. The aircraft fought her inputs, refusing to respond normally. As you can see, General, conventional methods are insufficient with compromised systems. General, Williams watched intently as the X-47 continued its spiral, altitude decreasing steadily despite Elena's textbook efforts to recover. Now the Kasnov reversal, Elena announced, her voice calm despite the challenging conditions. She began the counterintuitive sequence of control inputs that initially worsened the spiral. Behind her, General Williams gripped her seat restraints as the aircraft's descent rate increased dramatically. It went against every instinct, developed over decades of flying to allow an aircraft to spiral more aggressively when trying to recover. Then, impossibly, the spiral began to arrest. The X-47's momentum shifted from uncontrolled descent to controlled recovery, exactly as Elena had calculated years earlier in her academy thesis. Remarkable, General Williams breathed as they returned to level flight. The G-forces alone should have exceeded structural limits. The key is timing and precision, Elena explained. Execute the sequence incorrectly, and the aircraft becomes unrecoverable. But done properly, the technique uses the spiral's own energy against itself. I want to see it again, General Williams said. But this time, I want you to teach me the inputs as you perform them. For the next 30 minutes, Elena walked General Williams through the theoretical foundation and practical execution of advanced spiral recovery. The general's questions revealed both deep understanding and the kind of tactical thinking that had made her legendary in military circles. The combat applications are obvious, General Williams noted as they prepared for their final demonstration. An aircraft that can recover from situations that would destroy conventional fighters has enormous strategic value. Yes, ma'am. But it requires pilots trained specifically for these conditions. Traditional training is insufficient. Elena performed the Kasnov reversal one final time, this time with General Williams providing commentary and asking questions that demonstrated her growing mastery of the technique. As they began their descent toward Edwards, General Williams was quiet for several minutes. Elena wondered if she was calculating the political and military implications of what she'd just witnessed. "Captain," General Williams finally said, "I need to ask you something personal." Elena's pulse quickened. "Yes, ma'am?" 5 years ago, you were dismissed for emotional instability. Today, you've demonstrated the most controlled flying I've ever observed. How do you reconcile those two facts? Elena considered her answer carefully. This was the moment of ultimate truth, not just about her flying ability, but about her character and fitness for leadership. "General, I learned that processing emotion quickly isn't the same as being controlled by emotion. When my brother died, I grieved intensely but briefly. The military interpreted that as instability, but it was actually the opposite: rapid emotional processing that allowed me to continue functioning." "And that ability helps you in the cockpit?" "Yes, ma'am. In crisis situations, I can acknowledge fear, uncertainty, or pressure without being paralyzed by them. I process the emotion and move forward with clear thinking." General Williams nodded slowly. "That's a valuable skill in both peacetime and combat." They landed smoothly, and as Elena completed shutdown procedures, she felt the weight of uncertainty about her future. General Williams had observed everything with professional interest, but it revealed nothing about her conclusions or intentions. As they climbed from the cockpit, a crowd of senior officers waited on the tarmac, including Colonel Blackwood and Dr. Fleming. Elena realized that her demonstration had attracted far more attention than she'd anticipated. General Williams addressed the assembled group with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, I just witnessed the most significant advance in aviation training since the introduction of jet aircraft." Elena felt her heart skip as the general continued. "Captain Rodriguez's techniques aren't just innovations, they're essential capabilities for the next generation of military aviation. Her training program will be expanded immediately and integrated into our advanced pilot development pipeline." The crowd erupted in congratulations and applause, but General Williams held up a hand for silence. "However," she continued, "expanding this program requires the right leadership. Captain Rodriguez, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to major an assignment as Director of Advanced Flight Training for all experimental aircraft programs." Elena stared at General Williams, hardly able to process what she was hearing. From dismissed cadet to program director in 5 years. It seemed impossible. "Do you accept this assignment, Captain?" General Williams asked formally. Elena straightened to attention, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, ma'am, I accept." As the crowd dispersed to begin implementing the expanded training program, General Williams approached Elena privately. "Major Rodriguez," she said, using Elena's new rank, "you've proven that sometimes the military's biggest mistakes lead to its greatest innovations. Your program will save lives and advance our capabilities in ways we're only beginning to understand." Elena felt tears threaten for the 3rd time since her reinstatement, but this time they were tears of pure gratitude and achievement. "Thank you, General. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," General Williams replied with a rare smile, "because you've already proven that the best pilots aren't the ones who never face adversity. They're the ones who transform adversity into excellence." As General Williams departed, Elena stood alone on the tarmac with the X-47 behind her and her future stretching ahead like an unlimited sky. She had not only reclaimed her place in military aviation, she had helped redefine what was possible. The girl who had been labeled unstable was now responsible for training the most elite pilots in the Air Force. It was a vindication beyond her wildest dreams, and it was only the beginning. 6 months later, Major Elena Rodriguez stood before the largest gathering of military aviation personnel in Edwards Air Force Base history. The newly constructed Advanced Flight Training Center bore her name on the dedication plaque, though. She tried unsuccessfully to have it changed to honor her late brother instead. In the audience sat her first graduating Class 12 pilots, who had successfully completed the most demanding training program in military aviation. Among them, Captain Michael Torres had not only mastered her techniques, but had developed 3 new variations that were now being incorporated into the official curriculum. Major Richard Blackwood, Jr. sat in the front row. His earlier skepticism transformed into passionate advocacy for the program. He would be leading the next training cycle, bringing his own hard-earned insights to future classes. But it was the presence of certain individuals in the VIP section that made this moment truly meaningful for Elena. General Williams sat beside an elderly Hispanic woman with Elena's same dark eyes and determined chin, her mother, Maria Rodriguez, who had flown in from San Antonio for the ceremony. Next to her sat a young man in dress blues, whose pilot wings were barely a year old, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, Jr., Elena's nephew, named after her twin brother and carrying on the family tradition of military service. Dr. Fleming occupied his usual position in the back, still preferring to observe rather than seek attention. His recommendations for psychological evaluation protocols had been adopted Air Force-wide, revolutionizing how the military assessed pilot mental health and emotional resilience. Colonel Blackwood stepped to the podium, his expression carrying none of the cold calculation Elena remembered from their first meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago, we witnessed something unprecedented, the successful real-world execution of what many considered an impossible maneuver. He gestured toward Elena. Major Rodriguez didn't just save an aircraft and her fellow pilot. She proved that our understanding of human potential in aviation was fundamentally limited. Elena felt the familiar flutter of anxiety she'd experienced before every major presentation, but now she recognized it as fuel rather than weakness, rapid emotional processing that sharpened her focus rather than undermining it. Today's ceremony isn't just about graduating pilots, Colonel Blackwood continued. It's about graduating a new philosophy of aviation that embraces controlled instability as a path to superior performance. When Elena took the podium, she looked out at faces representing the future of military aviation. These pilots would fly missions she could only imagine, using techniques that had evolved far beyond her original theoretical work. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. I was dismissed from this very base for emotional instability. The evaluation wasn't wrong. I was unstable. I was grieving, processing loss, experiencing the full range of human emotion that comes with tragedy. She paused, making eye contact with several of her former students. What the evaluation missed was that instability, properly channeled and controlled, can be a source of strength rather than weakness. Just like the X-47 aircraft, human beings can learn to use their inherent instability as a tool for achieving what was previously thought impossible. In the audience, she saw Dr. Fleming nodding approvingly. His post-ceremony research had shown that pilots trained in her methods demonstrated significantly better performance under stress, not despite their emotional awareness, but because of it. The pilots graduating today have learned to process fear, acknowledge uncertainty, and transform pressure into precision. They've discovered that the edge between stability and instability isn't a place to avoid. It's where true excellence lives. Elena concluded her remarks by reading the names of the graduating pilots. each representing hundreds of hours of training that pushed human capabilities to new limits. As each graduate received their certification, she felt the deep satisfaction of having helped transform not just individual pilots, but the entire approach to advanced aviation training. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed to celebrate, at the officers' club, Elena found herself drawn to the hangar where it had all begun. The X-47 sat in its usual position, no longer the experimental prototype she'd first encountered, but now the foundation aircraft for an entire family of advanced designs. A mother approached quietly, moving with the dignity of someone who had raised children in military families and understood both the sacrifices and rewards that came with service. Maria Rodriguez said, using the Spanish endearment Elena hadn't heard in years, "Your father would be so proud. Both your fathers, the one who raised you, and the brother who inspired you." Elena embraced her mother, feeling the completeness that came from having family witness her vindication. "I thought about Marcus every day during the training. Everything I developed came from trying to honor what he taught me about pushing limits safely." Lieutenant Rodriguez Jr. joined them, his young face bright with admiration for the aunt he'd heard about, but barely remembered from his childhood. "Major Rodriguez, I've been studying your published papers in preparation for flight school. I hope I can apply to your program when I'm qualified." Elena smiled at her nephew, seeing echoes of both Marcus and herself in his eager expression. "Call me Elena, Marcus. And I hope you'll exceed everything your uncle and I ever accomplished." Dr. Fleming approached the small family group, carrying a folder that Elena recognized as containing her original academy thesis, now published in multiple aviation journals and required reading at flight schools worldwide. "Major," he said, "formally, I have one final piece of business related to your original work." Elena accepted the folder, wondering what could possibly remain unresolved about research that had been so thoroughly validated. "The European Aviation Consortium has requested permission to translate your spiral recovery techniques for civilian aircraft training," Dr. Fleming explained. "They believe your methods could revolutionize commercial aviation safety." Elena stared at the documents, realizing that her work would soon extend far beyond military applications. Commercial aviation? Large passenger aircraft face many of the same stability challenges as experimental military designs, Dr. Fleming continued. "Your techniques, properly adapted, could save thousands of civilian lives." As Elena signed the authorization papers, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. What began as theoretical work to honor her brother's memory had evolved into practical techniques that would influence aviation worldwide. Later that evening, at the Officers' Club celebration, Elena found herself surrounded by former students, colleagues, and friends, many of whom she'd met during her years as Rebecca Torres, but who now knew and accepted her complete story. Captain Torres, her former student, not her former identity, raised a toast that quieted the crowded room. To Major Elena Rodriguez, who proved that the most dangerous place for an aircraft isn't in a spiral. It's in the hands of a pilot who's afraid to use one. The laughter and applause that followed carried genuine affection and professional respect. Elena realized that for the first time since her brother's death, she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who valued both her skills and her authentic self. As the evening wound down, Elena stepped outside onto the base's observation deck, where she could see aircraft lights moving across the desert sky. Each aircraft represented pilots applying techniques that had emerged from her darkest moment, the day she'd been labeled unstable and dismissed from everything she'd worked for. General Williams joined her at the railing, carrying 2 cups of coffee against the desert night's chill. "Regrets, Major?" Elena considered the question seriously. "About the 5 years of hiding? The false identity? Sometimes. But I think those years taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way," such as, that excellence isn't about never falling down. It's about learning to use the fall to generate momentum for the recovery. Elena smiled at her own words, recognizing how perfectly they described both her personal journey and her flying techniques. General Williams nodded approvingly. The next generation of pilots will be lucky to learn from someone who understands that lesson so deeply. As General Williams departed, Elena remained alone under the vast desert sky, watching stars that seemed close enough to touch at this altitude and in this dry air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more students to train, new techniques to develop, boundaries to push in service of making aviation safer and more capable. She thought about the long path from Cadet Elena Rodriguez to Major Elena Rodriguez. The years of hiding as Rebecca Torres. The moment of truth in the X-47 cockpit when she'd chosen to reveal everything rather than let her fellow pilot die. Every setback had been preparation for the next advancement. Every moment of instability had taught her something about balance. Every time she'd been forced to start over, she discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. Elena Rodriguez had learned to live at the edge between stability and instability, transforming what others saw as weakness into her greatest strength. She'd proven that the most exceptional pilots, and perhaps the most exceptional people, weren't those who never experienced turbulence, but those who learned to dance with it. As she headed back to her quarters, Elena passed the memorial wall where her brother's name was etched, alongside other pilots who had given their lives in service. She paused, placing her hand on the cold metal beside Marcus Rodriguez's inscription. "We did it, hermano," she whispered. "The theory you helped me believe in, it's saving lives now." The desert wind carried her words away into the darkness. But Elena felt a peace she hadn't experienced since the day she'd lost him. Her brother's death had started her on this path, but it was her own resilience, determination, and refusal to accept defeat that had carried her through to this moment. In her quarters, Elena changed out of her dress uniform and into comfortable civilian clothes for the first time in months. On her desk sat a letter that had arrived that morning, acceptance to the graduate program at MIT, where she would spend the next 2 years developing the theoretical foundations for the next generation of unstable aircraft designs. She would return to Edwards as Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, with even greater knowledge and capabilities to share with future pilots. The journey that had begun with disgrace and dismissal was far from over. It was evolving into something larger than she had ever imagined possible. Elena picked up the photograph Dr. Fleming had returned to her, the image of herself and Marcus laughing together in their flight suits. For 5 years, she had carried grief and anger over his loss. Now she carried something different, gratitude for the time they'd had together and determination to honor his memory through excellence rather than bitterness. She placed the photograph on her nightstand where she could see it each morning, not as a reminder of loss, but as inspiration for the unlimited possibilities that lay ahead. Outside her window, the lights of Edwards Air Force Base stretched across the desert, each illuminated building representing dreams, ambitions, and the relentless human drive to push beyond previously accepted limits. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to transform what others considered impossible into routine excellence. Major Elena Rodriguez closed her eyes and slept the deep, peaceful sleep of someone who'd found her true calling and embraced it completely. She had learned to thrive in the space between stability and chaos, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is play it safe. Her story had become legend at Edwards, the pilot who was dismissed for instability only to return and revolutionize aviation training through controlled instability. But Elena knew it wasn't really about redemption or vindication. It was about discovering that true strength didn't come from never falling, but from learning to fall with such grace and purpose that the fall itself became flight. In the morning, She would wake up and continue the work of teaching others that excellence lived not in the safe middle ground, but on the beautiful, terrifying edge where only the most exceptional dared to fly. The girl they had once called unstable had become the woman who taught the world that stability was overrated and that the most extraordinary achievements came from those brave enough to dance with uncertainty and transform it into art. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.